Portland Children's Levy Allocation Committee meeting. I'm Ted Wheeler, and I am the mayor, and I'm also the Allocation Committee chair. I'd like to introduce my colleagues. Multnomah County Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson is here, and Julie Young is here. She is an appointee of the City of Portland. Mitch Horniker is the business community representative. He's here with us as well. And I believe Felicia's joining us later. Is that correct? Maybe she'll be here. She usually is. And if not, well, we'll figure something else out. We have the staff here. They'll introduce themselves when they get up before us. Before we do anything, let's approve the June 3rd minutes. Is there any objection to those minutes? Seeing none, June 3rd minutes are approved. Public comment. This is the time when if people want to publicly comment on something that is not on the agenda, let us know. There's other opportunities to comment on things that are on the agenda. But if somebody just has general comments or comments about anything that's not on the agenda, this is the best time to do it. Any takers? Very good. Seeing none, then our first agenda item has Meg providing us additional information on public input that we've received over the last month or so on the program area strategies, which we've discussed a couple of times. And it's my understanding, Meg, you're going to review a couple of potential changes based on that feedback. And then, of course, before we take a vote on that, we'll ask for public testimony on this item as well. Good afternoon, Meg.
Good afternoon, Mayor. Good afternoon, all. Thanks for being here with us today. Before we get started, just a couple of clarifications. Felicia Tripp-Folsom was going to try to call in to today's meeting from attending a memorial service in the Bay Area, and she has not yet called in, so we weren't entirely sure how, and she wasn't entirely sure how her schedule would shake out today, so she was...
No worries.
We hooked it all up in the chance that it would work, but we also knew there was a chance it might not, so we'll just stay tuned. So I want to just kind of take a step back for a minute and reflect on how quickly things have moved and how much work has taken place in a short period of time, but also take us back almost a full year. So we've been at thinking about how to approach the upcoming round of grant making over the past year. Last summer, staff compiled a document that outlined local data on needs of children in Portland and Multnomah County. Then we hired a community engagement consultant who did a robust and 9-month-long process, speaking with over 500 people in our community about their input around what and how the levy should be going about its business. And we also hired a small team at Portland State University to talk to past applicants, both those who had received funding and those who hadn't, around ways to improve our grant-making process. And then as staff who've been doing this work for some time, we're also bringing our experience and lessons learned and reflections on how research and studies in the fields that the Children's Levy funds have been evolving over the past several years. So that backdrop is how we approach the work that brings us to today. And the work that brings us to today includes 3 big decisions that you all have before you to make. The first is adopting the strategies, funding strategies for each of the 6 program areas. And we'll talk about those, as the mayor said, shortly. Then we'll talk about the template for the request for investment document. So that serves as, people shorthand that to RFI in our world, request for investment. Others know it as an RFP, but it's the guidance and instructions for the grant applications that will be submitted. And then you'll also be talking about the review process, the process that will be used to recruit volunteer reviewers to score the applications, and that's part of the information you'll use to make decisions next spring. So those are the 3 big decision points today, and then also we'll review the timeline of the coming year and all the steps that will occur to get us to providing grants by next spring. So any questions on kind of the content of today's meeting? And if not, I'll start with our strategies work. Okay, so you all have a draft of the kind of final document that staff is proposing that outlines the funding strategies in each of the levy's 6 program areas, and our audience has that document as well. There are a couple of minor changes that staff has made to the document. I'll review those in a minute. There were a couple of clarifications and changes that you all requested, and we've made those. And then we solicited feedback from the community at large between the meeting that you all had on May 13th and to the 10th of June around these strategies, as well as the request for investment template, as well as the proposed review process. So over the period of 4 weeks, we had a short SurveyMonkey survey open with 4 open-ended questions that people could respond to anonymously. People were able to provide input to us via email, or they could come to the 3 meetings that you've had over the past few weeks and also provide testimony. So we'll talk a little bit about the feedback that came in via that 4-week comment period. So in the strategies, the minor changes that have been made by staff are to what we're calling the features in a couple of the program areas. So each program area has a set of funding strategies, and in the document preceding those strategies are a bullet-pointed list of what we're calling features for the program area. Those features are, again, they came through from community engagement, and they really outline priorities, the things that we're most interested to see across the strategies in that program area. They are not necessarily requirements, so there was some clarification from feedback that I'll get to in a minute that raised questions about some of the features. So I just want to say up front, the features are really the highest priority items across strategies that came through community engagement for that particular program area. So in the program areas of after school and hunger relief, the first iteration of the strategies document didn't have focus populations listed in the features. Those have been added to the copy that you have before you. And the focus populations are informed by the local data work that staff did last summer. And they are also the same priorities in those program areas that have been in place since 2014. And then for features in the child abuse prevention intervention area, staff removed one of the features that talked about programs exhibiting open communication between the program and family participants, because we felt like that was already covered in the feature about being a trauma-informed approach and using family voice in programming. So those are just minor changes that staff made because they were oversights in our previous document. As far as changes that you all requested, during your discussion at the May 13th meeting, you all asked that it be more clear what the goals of each program area are and the outcomes that are typically commonly tracked by programs funded in those program areas. So that was added to the document. In the foster care program area specifically, we were asked to consider revising strategy number 1 in the foster care program area to call out recruiting foster parents as part of that strategy. So we've added that. That was also something that community engagement had called out, so we are happy to add that. And then finally, in the after-school program area, we revised the first strategy to include the word intensive, which was also requested at the previous meeting. So those are the major changes, or I shouldn't say major, those are all, I think, sort of smaller changes in general. There haven't been huge changes made to the document otherwise. And now I will review the public feedback that we received during the 4-week comment period that we had. There were only 7 people who weighed in with input around the strategies, 5 of them anonymously through the short SurveyMonkey that we had, and 2 grantees. And there weren't clear themes that came because there are so few responses that came in. So we took time to paraphrase the responses that people provided and provide a response. They took the time to weigh in. We wanted them to see that we heard their feedback and considered it. Had there been many more responses, we would have tried to theme it and kind of get to higher level issues that came out. But we're taking these few that we heard and responding. In some ways, I guess I'm not surprised to think that we didn't hear more feedback, only because we have done for the past 9 months such a huge process to try to hear from the biggest stakeholders of the work that we do. So we'll do our best to respond to what we've heard so far. So one of the one piece of feedback that we received, and it did influence how we characterized the rationale for a strategy in child abuse prevention intervention and an after-school program area, had to do with how we talked about data related to children of color and their outcomes as a result of being involved in the child welfare system and the public education system. And the way that we characterized rationale for a strategy in each of those program areas implied that children of color were to blame for the outcomes of the system, and perpetuates notions of racism in how we characterize that. So we apologize for how we characterize that. We regret having made that implication, and we removed that citation from our rationale. And
Oh, no.
I think that's on her end.
apologies.
You almost had her.
I'm going to keep going, if that's all right. All right. So we made changes to the rationale in the two strategies in the program areas.
I don't think Felicia's going to be able to call in.
I dare you to try.
I appreciate the comic relief.
Called in, she was on the line, and then, I don't know what happened.
All right. We'll do our best. I think she was the way she characterized it to us is she was most interested in being able to participate in the conversation and vote around the review process. So if we can figure out how to make that happen, but that comes up a little later in the agenda. So I'll keep going. The remaining feedback that we received did not cause change, did not result in us proposing any changes to the strategies document. It was more issues for our consideration, and we wanted to share that with you. So we did summarize that for you, and the audience has it here today. Some of the things that people raised are thinking about the workforce supply concerns for programs and trying to find folks who are bilingual or multilingual in some of the languages that we need to be serving in our community. Another person raised concerns about the transportation costs. If applicants are to be providing transportation directly, for example, in an after-school program that serves multiple sites, the costs of that are quite great, which means they may be able to serve fewer, they'd be asking for a lot of money, and ultimately you all would have policy considerations about spending money on transportation for a particular program versus potentially funding numerous programs and serving more children. We will be supplying information to you about transportation that is proposed in applications. Another individual raised considerations about our basic needs strategy in child abuse prevention intervention and suggested it should be a strategy across all of the program areas. Our response to that was that it came up particularly in the child abuse prevention intervention program area community engagement feedback, so we really structured that strategy around that. Another individual raised concerns about the mentoring strategy and it calling out wanting to prioritize programs that feature paid staff as mentors as opposed to volunteers. And again, staff felt that we're not requiring the applicants only propose programs with paid staff as mentors, but prioritizing those because that's what came out of community engagement, and that is what community engagement in the mentoring area also prioritized attention to quality and training of mentors, and in PCL's past experience, the ability for quality control around volunteer mentoring can be sometimes more difficult to make sure that people attend the training they're being asked to in order to do mentoring, and then sticking with that relationship over time. So those were the big pieces of feedback around the strategies, and those were the proposed few changes that we had. So I'm going to open it up for questions from you all, and then we have the opportunity for testimony from folks here. And then you all can decide how to proceed with the strategies, and then we'll talk about the request for investment.
Very good. Is there any public testimony on this issue? Okay, there's no public testimony, so we're, oh, wait. Sorry, Judy, didn't see you there, I apologize.
Okay. No problem.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Hi.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Judy Strand from Metropolitan Family Service, and we did provide some feedback, and we just wanted to clarify it a little further because one of the concerns we have is finding a way to support our intergenerational mentoring program, Experience Corps, because the after-school strategy is pretty much aligned with what we're doing. However, with older adults, they many times do not prefer to work that late in the day. And so we would like to propose consideration of extending the time frame to be flexible to align with school day if that is helpful to the mentors or tutors who are coming to the program, particularly for older adults who tend to want to work during the school day. And we've just found that that is powerful and does work, but we cannot get the numbers that we're going to need to get the dosage to do after school with older adults. We've tried and we failed. So I just wanted to say, coming off of the intergenerational global meeting last week in this community, if we want to bring these elders to our schools and keep them there in the 6 schools, we're going to need a little flexibility for the way in which older adults like to work, which might be a little bit different than younger adults. The second thing is there's some mention around the volunteerism, and we equally are feeling that our mentors, especially those who are looking for supplemental income, are very happy to take the stipends that we offer to them, and they consider that as a powerful economic resource for them. So I don't know if we had adequate older adult input in the focus groups, but we wanted to bring those awarenesses forward, not just for our program, but for any programs that may want to bring older adults as a resource to the Children's Levy service categories. Mei Ling.
My name is Mei Ling Shiroishi. I'm a retired elementary school principal and got to know Experience Corps in 1995 when we piloted at my school. I just am concerned that the levy, as it goes forward, is really making a break between after-school programs and the school program. And I want you to consider that as you go through. I think it's very important to connect the school itself, its teachers, its curriculum, all of its flavor and climate and value system to what's happening in the after-school program. And that doesn't always happen. Lots of times the school it's 2 places. They're yours after school and they're ours during school. And 3 o'clock is the breaking point. I want you to remember that mentors in the schools, volunteers in the schools, paid or not paid, can build credibility and trust and acceptance and communication by being part of the school day too and the school community. So they aren't 2 separate things. So often it's them and us. And it shouldn't be. It should be a partnership that also allows us to respond culturally to the differences in language and to the credibility and trust that immigrants and people living in poverty need to begin to trust a school community for support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, Mayor. Is this on?
There we go.
Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Ruby Houghton Pitts, and I am the State Director for AARP here in Oregon. I've had an opportunity to work with Experience Corps, which is an AARP program, partially funded through the AARP Foundation. And I became a fan when the program was new coming to us, and I have stayed a fan for a number of reasons. When AARP took over the Experience Corps program, I was an executive board council member for AARP here in Oregon. I lived here before I moved back. And I stayed with that when I moved away and then came back to the state of Oregon. So I'm sitting here now with Judy, still as a fan. And I wanted to make you aware of a couple of things. When I took a look at the community engagement design that we were just going over, it closely mirrors Experience Corps with some flexibility that these two ladies have been talking about as it relates to time of day. Children need care all day long. It's not one time or another. They need it all day long. And when a program is well implemented, like Experience Corps, the focus is for children to learn to read. And we know what happens when children can't read, and we need to be very direct when we say this. Our prisons are built off of fourth grade reading levels. The reason why AARP chose this program, Experience Corps, is because it takes into account what seniors can bring to a school and what children need in a school, learning how to read. So it does some things for seniors that I'm not sure that we share very often. What it does is it helps those individuals combat loneliness. It also helps them with their overall health and well-being. And when a child has an adult who cares, who's teaching them, whether it's the teacher, the parent, or a volunteer, they begin to thrive. And what we sometimes miss out on is that our seniors thrive and our children thrive. And the systems for which we are trying to keep people out of do so much better. So my reason for being here is that I wanted to make sure that you knew that AARP has a number of things that we do across the country in order to support these programs. And let me just highlight a few. We're helping to identify individuals, but especially people of color, who are culturally relevant and responsive and focused and trauma-focused as well, which fits into what you're trying to do here. We're also partnering with intergenerational organizations, and we've come before Ted Wheeler and we've talked about those as well in our Age Friendly initiative. We're also encouraging continued funding so that volunteers are being paid a small stipend so that they can show up at the school when they're supposed to show up and they can get home safely. That ties into the transportation that's offered in our city. We're also encouraging that EC staff, Experience Corps staff, reflect the populations of people that are being served. Now, AARP is doing all of these things so that we can combat loneliness in seniors, but more importantly, so that we can keep children from entering our penal system, where they can do us no good as we age. So I want to thank you for giving me a chance to share with you, and also to let you know that AARP is always ready to serve. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Could I ask a couple of questions here? Obviously, Experience Corps has been around for a while. It's had very successful outcomes, and I would be concerned if we did something that would unintentionally derail that success. So I want to say that first and foremost. And I, of course, strongly support the nexus between serving both the youth who want, as you say, to have a caring adult in their lives, somebody who can work with them, who brings some experience to the table, but it also has an added benefit to older adults in our community as well. We should be looking for those nexus opportunities as much as possible. But I'm trying to figure out specifically here with regard to the policy that we are about to vote for. Number one, what would be the implication of not altering the policy as it's currently drafted? And number two, what is it specifically you are asking us to amend in this policy?
I think it's the after-school strategy is the one that best fits with the work that Experience Corps is doing in terms of the focus. All of the criteria in terms of the services that are being delivered, the focus on social, emotional, all of those things would work for us. But what doesn't work is if we have to provide the services just in the after-school space. So what we're asking for is, could we expand that to include school day as long as we're aligned with those principles, not just after school? Because our mentors don't fit into the mentoring category because they are academically focused around reading. That's the problem. We can't fit into the mentoring.
So, maybe I'm just thinking
Yeah.
out loud. I'm not suggesting a particular policy. I'm
Right.
literally just thinking out
Right.
loud, which for me is a dangerous thing always. If we made that exception in the case where it is difficult otherwise for mentors to be available,
What do you all think about that?
is that one potential strategy?
I'm going to ask the experts.
I think so, because I think that the funding of Experience Corps, and to be more direct, if this funding goes away, we will lose some schools. And we don't want to lose schools in this program. We'd actually rather add schools for children who need reading tutors. And I don't want us to lose any schools.
But do you think that it makes sense to say for
Oh,
those who?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
How about you, Mei-Ling?
I'm an optimist. I think it'll work.
I wonder
Commissioner?
this. Whoa, Julie, come on.
I just had a couple points. Is this on?
Doesn't sound like it.
Is it on now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Lights off, believe it or not.
First of all, I think we're going back and forth between a couple of terms. One is mentoring and one is tutoring.
Yeah.
It's my understanding, or what I just want to check it out, that what Experience Corps does really is more tutoring than
It is.
mentoring. Is that
It
true?
is.
Okay,
We
so
have always historically called it mentoring within the model, but in terms of Portland Children's Levy definition, it's tutoring.
Okay, thank you. The other thing is that I wasn't here when Children's Levy, I voted on it the first time, but I wasn't actually sitting here, and I'm not sure that the term after school, how it was defined. I don't know that anywhere does it say, and maybe, yeah, Lisa's going to jump in. Or
Meg,
I'm
I wish
sorry,
Lisa
Meg.
were here because she's the lawyer in our office and she would have the more legal response to this. It is something I would want to check, not only with Lisa, but with the city attorney's office, because the original definition, I believe, had to do with how the state of Oregon school funding local option levies can and can't be used. And I think that the definition of after-school and summer programming was actually quite intentional in order to be in compliance with regulations around how much additional taxation can occur for use of money during the school day.
Okay.
So I'm not sure if I don't think we have the option to amend the after-school policy to include programming during the school day. My staff advice would be that the mentoring strategy as it's conceived now, while I appreciate, Judy, your point very much about sort of, it doesn't call out tutoring, it's really talking about mentoring. I believe that what you're describing still wanting to do would still be a better fit in that program area than it would be in the after-school program area, because I don't see us being able to amend how after-school is being defined. But I would want to check that with the city attorney's office before we issued a final decision.
So I guess that then we would need to look more closely at the fact that we would have volunteers, not paid mentors, with Experience Corps, if that's an issue or not. And
There's nothing in the mentoring strategy now that precludes anyone from proposing a volunteer or paid mentoring program, just more what the priorities were, that's all.
And I think that the definition of paid mentor, again, that's a term that is attached to the program. It is a stipend, so that people can get to and from and can buy a meal if they can't afford to do that.
And there's a bit of a precedence on some of the Portland city commissions where we've needed people, particularly people who are lower income, who are making a true sacrifice by participating. We've found that to be an important, I won't say an inducement, but a reduction of barriers to their actual participation. Do you have a comment?
No, I was just actually just wanting to get some clarification because I think what the voters actually voted on said after-school programs is one of those, and so I was concerned about our ability to even make that change from a legal standpoint.
Yes, that point's well taken. It says both after-school and summer programming.
So Judy,
Yeah.
with this information in mind, and it sounds like what Meg is telling us, there may be a legal impediment here, but that the door is also open in another program area. Does that address your issue?
I think so. I'm looking through all of the, we had a number of points about the mentoring program. I'm just making sure that we're eligible. Hopefully, we will be. So we will do our very best and try that category.
Good, because I'll just stay on the right. I would hate for us to inadvertently create a structural impediment to an intergenerational play here in the schools. I think that would be a huge mistake. So it sounds like we're in agreement that they could apply under a different category.
Yes. Experience Corps was funded in the mentoring program area in the past. That program area over the last 5 years has shifted toward focusing on older youth, middle school and high school age youth, which was one of the contributing factors to that program no longer being funded. But it wasn't ineligible based on the fact that it had intergenerational relationship-based work between older adults and children as its primary delivery. So.
Okay.
Okay,
Well, we'll
good.
go for that category. Thank you for your
that-
time.
To
Thank you
be
for
continued.
coming.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks
Thank
all
you
three.
very much.
Thank you very much.
Any additional public testimony on this particular item? Very good. So any discussion, or are we just calling for a vote, Meg? On the program area strategies.
The only clarification I would add is that I think that Judy's original request to consider amending the after-school program area to include the school day does warrant clarification from staff to any applicant, so we will be sure to follow up with that because I feel quite confident that we can't. And I just
Okay,
want to make
well,
sure we are clear about communicating that so that it's not confusing for any other potential applicant about what after-school does or doesn't include.
Yeah, that's good, and I appreciate the testimony clarifying that point, because, again, I want to make sure we're not inadvertently throwing down obstacles to those kinds of programs. Do you need a vote? Sorry, Mitch, do you have another
I've got a
comment?
question.
You bet.
First, maybe. On the child abuse and prevention, item number 3, the second bullet point, client assistance funds.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about how you would see short-term being defined and also what it means to be tied to at least one other proposed service approach?
So short-term, really the intention there is to address avoiding crisis situations. So short-term could be a one-time, or that there's a plan in place to be able to continue to provide that support if ongoing support's needed. For example, if housing was an issue, if somebody needed help with a down payment, or a deposit, with a deposit, or a portion of a month's rent, but there was a plan in place for the next month being
Could I interrupt for a moment?
Sure.
Who do we have joining us today in our chamber?
These are children that are involved in the social justice art camp with Don't Shoot Portland.
Excellent.
And they just left the Smirk Center at New Avenues, meeting with some kids that are going to Washington DC to meet with Senator Wyden to talk to them about things that are important to them. And so, learning from the older students on how they're gonna petition what they need, they made signs and they came from your office, signed the guest book, signed up to talk to you about the things that are important to them. And most of it was school-based because some of the kids have been involved in bullying on the end of receiving it. Some kids have had to seek advocacy for housing. All kinds of things that they discussed just from listening to the older students. And I was telling them that as they grow older and they're able to articulate their issues to their peers, we hear those things and we're able to do what we need to do to resolve those issues, but they need to be able to communicate and have their voices heard, so we're teaching them what that process looks like.
Thank you for bringing them here, and kids, thank you so much for being here at City Hall. We appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm gonna tell you one thing they didn't like is the waving on the way in. And so
The wand?
people, the wand,
Oh, yeah.
being checked as children.
Oh, yes.
So even the people, when they were lined up, they were like, we don't want to do this, so we said we'd let you know.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thanks, kids, for being here. We really appreciate it. Thank you. Sorry, thank you very
No,
much.
that's.
Good
no.
question.
Wouldn't want them to leave without knowing their
What brought
purpose.
them,
Yeah,
yeah.
I thought they wanted to speak.
So,
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, with that definition, we have a extremely deep need for the type of coverage that you just mentioned. It is at the epicenter of our homeless crisis, these keeping people from falling into homelessness. But we could spend every dollar we have allocated into just this single idea and not make a dent. So I guess I'm a little concerned about opening up this. I don't remember this being in the last definition. Is this part of the new
Right.
one?
This is new. This strategy is a new strategy. In the past, there programs that we currently fund, many of them have client assistance funds as part of the budget that they have
Right.
with us. And each of those have their own criteria and ways that they manage that. The amounts that are in the current grants are not huge amounts, probably typically between $2,000 and $6,000 a year. Some have more, but that's probably the average. It's a concern. It continues to come up in community engagement. It was a concern in 2014, and it's a concern again. And really looking at this as a way to hopefully at least prevent some families from becoming involved in the child welfare system. So we know it's not going to take care of every issue. We're not going to be able to meet every issue. But if this is something that could support some families and be of assistance, we wanted to include it.
Right. Well, I mean, I think everybody up here is probably working in some way or another on the bigger issue. So we're all proponents, and we all know it needs to happen. It's just, I guess, would a client have to already be engaged to obtain this service, or would the first thing that they sign up for be this benefit?
So as part of this service approach, I think that addresses your other question was, what does it mean to be engaged with one of these other service strategies? So it wouldn't just be a standalone client assistance fund that could just be accessed. So a family would need to be engaged with one of the other strategies in the enhanced parenting or response, or if they were involved in case management services. So it's not just a standalone fund for anyone in the community to access.
So in that way, it'd be more targeted, so they'd already be
Exactly.
enrolled, they'd already had been identified as at high risk or at risk or already in case
Right,
management.
they'd be working on other aspects of
Yeah.
child abuse prevention and family safety.
Okay.
I had a question also under, actually, I have a couple of things, but the first is just following up with the child abuse prevention and intervention. Noted to intervene to lessen harms and prevent future risk, which of course I agree with. But under rationale, the language is providing mental health therapy and counseling for children and their families. Under possible service approaches, it says treatment and other healing approaches. I just wanted to note that, I mean, this is something that I supposedly, and I'm sure there are always challenges, that people who are participating under the Oregon Health Plan would be receiving therapy. So I'm just curious around, or I just have a question around that. And certainly there may be people who are not enrolled in any kind of insurance program, but really that's a responsibility that I believe the state has for providing mental health treatment.
So with this strategy, it's not intended to replace or take the place of OHP or other insurance coverage. It's meant to cover things that are not covered by insurance.
Okay.
So that's the purpose. It's not meant to take the place of.
Can I add a clarifying?
Sure.
Our understanding is that there are times when the mental health treatment needed for an individual may not be fully covered covered by their OHP plan, so the cost of delivering whatever the treatment service is may not be fully reimbursed by Oregon Health Plan. So this provides an opportunity for providers to not only find a way to finance the entire type of treatment they might want to be able to offer to somebody, but there's other services that may or may not be reimbursed by a particular health plan as well, like a group therapy type of intervention or a certain type of support group.
Okay. Thank you. Sure. The other area actually that I was, note that I had is under early childhood. And in the information provided to the committee ahead of time, you note, you talk about childcare.
Yes.
And it says that priority will be considered as a strategy on its own, crossing program areas and brought to the allocation committee separately.
Correct.
Is
So
that being brought to us separately?
It will, but we were going to wait to do it in the fall. The community childcare initiative that you all have invested in provides childcare subsidy to working families in Portland whose incomes are 200% of the federal poverty level or less, and helps them augment their state-funded employment-related daycare subsidy to pay no more than 10% of their income toward childcare. That is all run through Mount Hood Community College's Child Care Resource and Referral of Multnomah County. It's a large initiative that has, like all of our other grants, funding through next June. And it supports families with children ages 6 weeks to age 12. So it's early childhood and before and after school care. So it's not an early childhood specific program area strategy, and childcare itself is called out separately in the ballot language, and because it has been an initiative that we have handled separately from the program area competitive investments, we were going to wait to bring that back to you in the fall, also after we've had another year of their performance data come in. They've been doing well, but we wanted to have everything we could before we came back and asked you to consider that particular investment differently, since it hasn't typically been a competitive investment.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so do we need to then take a vote on the program area strategies?
Yes, please.
All right,
So moved.
we have a motion.
I second it.
Motion and a second. All in favor, vote aye.
I just
I'm
have,
sorry, Mitch?
yeah, I appreciate all the hard work that's been done. It's fabulous. I like all the changes. I've just thought a lot about stepping into the recruiting and retention of foster parents. And having better trained, higher functioning foster parents is absolutely critical. However, they will be operating in a system that, according to the Secretary of State and a lot of investigative reportings, has extremely large challenges. And there is definitely a suggestion that the highest functioning foster parents are burned out the fastest because of DHS just loads them up. As a result, until we see further progress on DHS's improvement strategies that I think they're a year into now, I can't bring myself to think that our dollars spent on retention, or recruitment and retention, are going to go as far as dollars directly aimed at foster kids. So that is, of all the things, that's the only thing that I just can't get comfortable with, and I'm not in favor of at this time. As funny as that seems when I call it a critical need, I just don't see how we're going to be able to move the needle on it. So that's, and if we take it as a block, I didn't know how to deal with that, but the rest of them I'm fine with.
So let me see if I can craft a compromise strategy here, because anything before it's funded has to come back to us. And so that question would once again, I think it's an entirely appropriate line of questioning, as it is with any of these. Can we move the dial? Is it the best use of programming? We have to decide how to weigh the different programming areas. I too am an optimist, as was said earlier, and I have high hopes for the foster care system and the work that DHS is doing. But I don't see that forwarding this package today in any way precludes us from making that decision on a program-by-program basis, unless somebody, disagrees. Is that correct, or is that not correct?
That's totally correct. You may get only one applicant who proposes to do that, and for other reasons, you do or don't want to fund that application, so.
Understood. Yeah, and I'm fine with that. I just felt
I'm
compelled to say that.
Yeah, I can't disagree with your logic there. All right, so all in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? And it passes. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, on to the next meaty topic, the template for the request for investments. So everybody here with us has a copy of that as well. And just a reminder, we, as a staff, use the same feedback opportunities to hear from folks during the 4-week comment period about anything they wanted to raise about the request for investment document. And again, remind you all, it will have 3 sections when we bring the program area specific RFIs back to you for publication and approval in the fall. So our work this summer will be to take this template and create one of these that is catered to each program area. The entire application from any given applicant will be worth 100 points. 36 points for the section that focuses on organizational capacity and commitment to racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. 54 points for program design, proven program design and effectiveness, and 10 points for a budget and budget narrative. And we don't have that section yet here for you. It has not, we haven't proposed changes to that one from what's been used in the past. So you'll see that with the program area RFIs when we bring them back in the fall. Couple of things that we as a staff tweaked in the draft that you have before you from the last time that you saw it. In the organizational section, we added 3 definitions. We added a definition on racial equity, and we added a definition on diversity. We took those both from the City Office of Equity and Human Resources definitions. And then we also added a definition of inclusion, which the city did not have included in its definition, so we borrowed from Race Matters Institute. Those are on page 1 of that section of the RFI. We also took a little bit of time to improve how we characterized language accessibility in item D in that section, to talk also about how applicants make sure that their communications are accessible, not just to people who need interpretation or translation, but also are using assistive technology devices to make sense of documents that are coming from email communications, website communications, and documents. And we ourselves are learning a lot through the city's digital access work and trying to improve our digital accessibility as well. The next part of changes I wanted to bring to your attention had to do with things that you requested from our previous meeting. So in our last meeting, when we talked about the program section of the RFI, I left with a reflection, realizing that I didn't do a great job of explaining and answering a particular question that was raised around best practice. And the thing I wished I had said was that the entire program section is really built around the basic tenets of best practice. It asks applicants to talk about who they plan, the intentionality of the design is part of best practice in child and family serving programs. So it asks applicants to identify and be clear about who they want to serve and why, which activities they'll be doing with that population and why, what attendance is expected in those activities to produce outcomes, which outcomes will result from those activities, and how staff will be trained to deliver a quality program along those lines. In addition, we added a definition to the program section on best practice that we borrowed from Merriam-Webster, and we added a definition around evidence-based programs that comes from Penn State's Evidence-Based Prevention and Intervention Support Center, just to be clear about the differences between those two things. And then in item E,
Can I interrupt
yeah,
you
go
there?
ahead.
Are they different?
Evidence-based programs and best practice?
Yep.
Yes, best practice can be based on science, but it can also be based on experience. And evidence-based programs are the types of programs where there has been robust scientific study of the particular intervention, where the study has been done in a way that produces that looks at comparison populations and produces statistical information around effects on the population that got the intervention, and that it's sustained over time. Not every best practice
Right.
has an evidence-based science behind it.
But all evidence-based programming is always best practice programming because it has large data to support what it's doing.
Yes, I hear what you're saying.
So,
Evidence-based
which is
programs use
fine.
best practice and.
Right, and I asked the question, so I really appreciate you coming back to it. The thing that I thought was a little confusing is in the first sentence, we say we're going to invest in best practices, and then we give them the definition of best practice. Then we give them the definition of evidence-based programming, but we don't say we're going to invest in evidence-based programming.
We say that we're going to invest in best practice because that's what we're going to do, because not everything is evidence-based. So we just wanted to sort of leave open, in case it was confusing to people, that we're not expecting that everything that gets proposed for funding is an evidence-based program.
Okay, so we should say that then. Because
Okay.
I'm just saying, when I read it, it says what defines best practice, and maybe I missed it, but then when we then give the definition for evidence-based programming, I'm assuming that that's important to us. And you're right, we don't say that it is anywhere else in the document. At least that I could find.
Yes, I think I hear what you're saying, and it sounds to me like you're saying it's just confusing how we're characterizing this. And
At least for one person.
the intent was to communicate to people, we're not expecting that you are only proposing evidence-based programs. Because in our experience, people have proposed those and haven't always been successful pulling them off, but they have been successful doing other programming that's based on best practice. So it may not be this trademarked evidence-based particular program model that was developed by this university and has now been replicated. Yeah, okay.
I'm with you.
So the intent of that section is to sort of say, we recognize that not everybody is doing work that falls on that standard of scientific evidence base. But we want to fund effective programs that demonstrate the things that are oftentimes included in best practice. So that's what that bulleted list there is supposed to represent.
I would just add just one suggestion. If we had a sentence at the end of that first paragraph that said what we're funding, what we will fund, I think it would make the whole paragraph a lot clearer.
So okay.
Because you give the definition, and then you say not all programs that are effective have evidence-based backup, great, but then don't we need to say, so we're open to funding, or we will consider funding best practice programs that are not evidence-based?
Sure. I guess I thought that the next sentence did that, but it sounds like it doesn't. PCL seeks to fund effective programs that demonstrate the following. And you're saying even between that sentence and the previous one, I need a better transition?
These seem to be important phrases, and that's the only reason I brought it up last time, and I'm bringing it up again.
Okay.
And when I'm just thinking about having reviewers that are steeped in this stuff and know the difference, and programming that probably knows whether they are or aren't, to be clear on whether or not they have an opportunity towards funding and a high score is important. So
Okay.
otherwise, that's, again, just one person's opinion.
So something like PCL will consider proposals using evidence-based models as well as other general best practices?
If
Got
that's
it.
what we'll do, that's what we should say. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't object to that language, so if that's helpful.
Great.
Julie, any thoughts?
I think if it helps you have clarity, that's great. For me, the first sentence in the paragraph kind of states that we're going to be funding programs that uses best practices and achieves and that it achieves positive outcomes.
Right.
And that the rest of the paragraph is explaining best practices includes, things that are experience and evidence-based, and then gives more detail about evidence-based. But if we need another clarifying sentence, that's fine with me.
I appreciate the point that Mitch made too, that the reviewers, that they may have questions, but my sense is that you also will be working very closely. The reviewers will have probably been made aware more than once of what this is, what our intent is, and those differences in semantics, so.
Yes.
But I think it's good.
You'll hear more about the review process in a little bit and have to decide on that. But yes, I mean, the proposed scoring criteria and what the reviewers will use is being published with this template. So yes, it should hopefully help them with those distinctions. Okay, so those were the main pieces of feedback that you all brought to our attention. And then there's feedback that came in through the comment period, again, anonymously through the SurveyMonkey, and that people emailed to us directly. A couple of folks brought to our attention that they had concerns about how the scoring of demographics of applicant staff is being characterized in the organizational section of the RFI. That section provides more points for organizations where a majority of clients, staff, and board identify as a person of color, and the individuals that raised those concerns referenced examples of large organizations that may have difficulty getting those points in the score overall, but they may have small units within their organization that focus on serving specialized populations. And staff's response is, yes, we understand that, and we hope that the other parts of that section of the RFI give an applicant ample time to talk about those unique features of how their organization is working on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Only 6 of the 36 total points in that section are looking at the demographics of this particular agency staff, clients, and board. So there's 30 other points that applicants can try to make the points up that they want about the type of work that they're doing. And again, we calibrated this entire section based on PSU's findings of our grant-making process on how to improve it, and also the feedback that we got through community engagement. A couple of other respondents noted concerns about how accurate demographic data will be in applications that come forward. They raised questions because demographic data collected from clients and from staff is optional, and some people may have fear around providing certain information about themselves to the organization that's serving them or employing them. And yes, as staff, we hear that concern. We provided in the application an opportunity for people to talk about how they arrived at the numbers that they'll be supplying in their application, so that reviewers can make sense of it using the narrative description of how applicants gathered that information and if they had to estimate it on what basis. Another piece of feedback that we heard at a previous meeting was that there are other special populations that the levy should consider. One of those is the justice-involved population, and that our current application doesn't necessarily call out that population. That is true. However, we have left that section of the RFI open so that if there are populations that we haven't called out or overlooked, that we hope an applicant can adequately talk about it in their responses to that section. And they can insert rows on the table that will be provided to describe the demographic characteristics of their clients, staff, and board to talk about those additional populations.
Can I ask a question on that?
Yes.
I was just wondering about why we did that. It seems like such an easy thing to say yes to in light of the fact that it's such a dramatic marker for kids having problems. And so when you say we have a place where you can identify others, are there a lot of other markers as significant as criminal justice system that we would expect to see there?
I personally don't know. I think as a person who positions myself as learning in this field every day. I think that there are possibilities of populations that we haven't considered or have overlooked where we want to give people the opportunity to include that information. We've really focused that section on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion because that is in part where the city's goals have led us, that is where community engagement led us, and that's where PSU's recommendations led us. But we also wanted to hold space for other populations that we either hadn't considered or had overlooked, and where, especially if you introduce a racial equity lens, that really matters. The justice population is a great example, but there could be others that we haven't thought about, but wanted to leave that open. So it's probably a dissatisfying answer to some extent. Okay. We also heard some feedback from a fellow funder to make our application use more plain language. So that's a movement that both state and federal government are trying to do to make everything that they produce in writing easier to read and understand. So we attempted to make our sentences shorter, use words that are more familiar to fewer clauses and more active voice. We had a couple of requests for clarifications on particular questions that were in the RFI, and we were already planning on providing guidance to applicants around examples of how to respond to certain questions, frequently asked questions around the RFI, and providing sort of those additional tips and pieces of information to help them. And then finally, we had a question raised about how we as a staff have considered the consequences of the RFI's priorities for racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. And in particular, it was raised, this person raised the questions about how those priorities may shift funding from what the Levy has currently been funding to other organizations or other types of services. And have we anticipated or thought about what that transition will look like? And our response is yes, somewhat, but ultimately every time the Levy runs a funding process, those possibilities for changes of what has been funding to funding new things is a possibility, and we manage those each time they come up. At the same time, we also recognize that the priorities that have been put into this particular RFI are born out of a history of institutional policies and practices that have resulted in unequal access to opportunities for children and families in our community, and we are asking how organizations are working to make better by those past inequities. So we may see shifts, and we will be prepared to support organizations and programs going forward. So with that, happy to answer more questions on the RFI, take any input, and that's the next piece of decision making.
One last question. On the scoring sheet for
Yes.
proven program, section E,
Yes.
I was looking at the first and fourth bullet, and I wondered if you could just explain how those are different.
First and fourth bullet. Okay, the
score sheet.
scoring. Yep, sorry. I'm on the questions.
Yeah.
The first and fourth, you
Yeah,
said?
the fourth bullet uses the phrase best practice. It seemed like the first bullet was just a definition of best practice without saying that, so is the first bullet where you'd see the newer innovative program proposal?
I think it's a little bit of both. The difficulty with best practice sometimes is there may also be best practices that somebody needs to explain that are particular to the type of service model that they're doing, home visiting or preschool, versus sort of the overall, we've chosen to do this particular service with this particular population because these are the things that we know produce the results that we want. And we're going to hire only these type of staff with this type of training, and make sure that our service is provided only this frequently. So there's, I think, two ways that people can get into the details of the service delivery there. One, at a higher rationale in general for what they plan to do with the population they plan to serve and why that population, and then one that's a more finer grain about best practices relative to that particular type of service they're proposing.
All right. Is there any public testimony on this item? Yes, sir. Come on up.
My name is Joseph Tietz. I'm the Executive Director of Pathfinder Network, and we predominantly serve the criminal justice population. I would respectfully argue that that demographic does stand out, to your question, Mitch, around, what predominant existing poverty, marginalization, victims of crime, the plethora of all those criteria. I can't think of another population that does meet it. So I think it does represent a statement from the Portland's Children Levy to identify that per se and to call it out.
Thank you. Anybody else? All right, anybody want to propose any changes before we call for a vote? Mitch?
Does anybody, how do you guys feel about that criminal justice issue? I'd be interested in hearing how you guys see that. Feel like I don't have a deep enough understanding to, but it just seems like something that's so obvious with kids.
I guess I need a little more information about how it would be reported, because are we talking about, we're looking for data regarding the parents and their participation in the criminal justice system? What exactly, what data are we looking for? Or the children, certainly we have teens who are sadly in the criminal justice system. So I need clarification on what are we looking for?
That's a good question.
I mean,
Joe?
I took it to understand we're telling the public what our priorities are for funding, right? And those include race. And the question is, do we want to add criminal justice as a priority, meaning that if the program is this is how I'm thinking about it, this is why I'm glad we're kind of talking through it, that a program serving that client base would, all other things being equal, be scored higher than a program not serving that base or some other priority population of ours. So it's just it's a way to elevate proposals.
Mm-hmm. I have a question. So is the area where you said that there is a space to put additional demographic information, the table X?
Yes. So it's an Excel document that applicants will be able to download. So they can insert additional rows for other characteristics, demographic variables, identifying types of information for populations that they would want to share and be able to talk about throughout that entire section of their application.
So just looking at the table X as at least the part that's in the packet, I don't see where they would put like other demographic information that might be important to include.
Yes, the way that this is formatted now is to print on one page for
Okay.
ease of reading for this group and for this decision making. But because it's an Excel document that it won't be protected or anything, and people will have to download it and then populate it with the information they need. They can insert rows. So what it means is when it gets submitted as an application, it may have another page.
So, I mean, would it be helpful if we had like, and maybe this is on the version that I can't see, but like, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If we had 6 other, and then this is a space for you to include other information that you think is relevant. And that way, because I think that people who have, have contact with the criminal justice system are one that might, like an organization might want to highlight, but there may be others as well. So maybe just opening it up that way.
Okay.
Would meet some of the needs that have been brought up.
Can I ask the person who testified a clarifying question? Is your intent to ask us to call out that population in the demographics we request? Or is it to ask that applicants, as a priority, serve that population?
I don't want to be acting in self-interest, so I'm going to say the former.
Okay. You want to be able to talk about it in the application as a called-out population that we've asked about.
And as a statement from the children's levy that states.
I hear you.
This is a population that is most marginalized and most at risk, and underpins almost every of the other categories when you look at it. There's close to 75,000 young people in this state alone who have some parent or involvement in the criminal justice system, and they are particularly invisible to many multiple systems because they don't fit into that necessarily category, other categories that have been identified.
So, go ahead. Well, so to me, one of the what's helpful about this table X, is being able to take a look and sort of map out the demographics of the clients, and then how it matches or doesn't match with the program or the organization who they're working with. I think that is part of our intent, or maybe the whole intent. And so if you have identified that you have clients are participating in the criminal justice system, but the people providing the service to them, some of them may also have history. I would think that that's true.
That was
But I would say the likelihood of is going to be lower. I could be exactly wrong on that in terms of management staff, board of directors, and all that. In other words, could it actually be a negative for us to call this out? Am I making any sense, or do I have an absolutely clueless in terms of how the organizations are operating?
I think your question's a good one. I think the thing that I don't know is organizations who may be providing services, particularly to this population as part of its intentionality and design, probably have a lot more information to supply about those demographics and how they work with that population. When I think about the average after-school program, for example, that the Levy funds, they may not know a lot about the justice-involved life experience of the children that they're serving. And doesn't mean they shouldn't, but at this point, that's not necessarily something that they're being asked to provide or track. And I think what I want to try to figure out is a balance between sending the message that we care about this population, so we're asking about it in this table, to and we expect you to start asking this information of children and families. So I want to be careful about how what we put in the table influences what people think they need to begin tracking and asking about. And I guess because you work with the population, I would defer to your expertise on what is the best advice for how to handle the tension that we're kind of surfacing.
I'm not sure I completely understand Julie's question, like concern, as worded. So I just think that in general, discussions of diversity, equity, inclusion, and particularly for children, need to be. Criminal justice is a known component and a factor that contributes to that. So I think we're missing an opportunity by not. But again, I may be myopic because of what I do in my life, and my life work. So I just want to, I feel it's my obligation to say it, but I may be wrong, but my understanding of it.
So I guess where I am is that I would like to have that information around what are the lives like for the children and families we're serving. I'm just not sure that I'm not sure that this table is the place to be of how it would best help us or reviewers in the decision making.
I agree. This table is only one piece of information, and we're asking a lot of other parts of the story in hopes that people can use other parts of the application to tell us that part of the story.
Yes, I want that story, but I'm not sure that this is the place for it.
Okay.
No. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer.
I mean, I think we can certainly add and ask. I think I would want to, when I think about the other types of, because this is a template that we have to use for each program area, and I think about the other types of questions that applicants have to answer, I just would want to figure out how to characterize the information that we ask for as, and if you don't have it, it's okay. But the hard part about that is that much of the information we're asking for has points attached to it and other values that influence their ultimate score. But I am concerned about the expectation that applicants who don't work with that population knowingly are being expected to start tracking information that they can't easily ask or use, or may not be pertinent to the particular service they're doing. It may be pertinent to how their staff are trained to do trauma-informed approaches in their after-school program, but it may not be important to whether or not children at school A or B should be provided this after-school program. So I hope I'm doing a good job characterizing the sort of challenge of what information we ask and why. I'm willing to add it, and I just think we have to be careful about it. We can also add it and come back to you in September.
Let's take it, see if we can answer the question a little differently. A program that is providing services to children or families who have had contact with the criminal justice system would invariably be dealing with a clientele that is overrepresented in the communities that we care about. And therefore, they should be in great position to score well on our questions about DEI, and as a result, should be able to compete just the way we have it set up now. That no matter what section you chose, if your particular program was mentoring or,
Sure.
whatever, you could say, or foster care or whatever, our particular population is those families and children that have, seems like you ought to be able to score well. And that by the population you're serving, you're being able to tell us, hey, I'm working with your priority population.
Yeah.
And that's what will get them funded.
Yes.
Assuming everything else, obviously.
Right. A lot of other things in the.
A well-run program, but.
Right.
So there is really no obstacle to a program submitting for funding. We might not be able to track it, or some programs might not know how much or how little their clients have touched criminal justice, but a program that is specifically focused on that would be able to tell us that.
Right.
And that would score well. So I guess answering my own question, it feels like we're in a position to fund programs like that.
Right. And I think the only pushback was, and by putting it as a discrete called out population, where we as a levy are sending a different kind of message. But,
Yeah, which is a good point.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, we can build it in there also for now as part of our draft program area RFIs that you all have to approve anyway in September, and we can come back with a final kind of recommendation about, like, this is going to work in this program area perhaps, but maybe it's not as, it feels a little bit more difficult to figure out how to proceed with it in this other program area, like hunger relief.
Yeah.
And I would just say, I would feel more comfortable with it just being like an other column or something that is more open-ended, because I feel like if you have something called out on the table or where you have it, and then it's not matched up with the point system, it's going to be confusing.
I agree.
So that's why I think if we have it open-ended, then people can put down what other demographic information is important for their programs and their organization, and that overall kind of, kind of more generic, like, question about if they have, if the staff reflects diversity of the clients that they serve, then it's like apples to apples comparison instead of like having something that's called out that's then not reflected in the points system.
Good. Any further discussion? So should we take a vote on the RFI template?
Yes, please.
I'll entertain a motion.
So moved.
Second.
A motion and a second. All in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Done. So I have to be the bearer of bad news. It is 20 after. You have 2 more items. I have a hard out at 4.
We can do
Can we
it.
economize?
Yes,
This
we
is gonna
have.
be quick.
Great.
Yeah, the next
Excellent.
one is
Thank
a decision point, and then the following is a review of timeline. So
Perfect, thank
you're
you.
doing great.
You got it.
So grant review.
All right, so I'll take you through this, and it will be much quicker than the discussion last time about, or the presentation about the grant review process. So I'll review the proposed changes to the review process quickly, summarize the concerns that you all brought up at the last meeting, and present a summary of the public feedback that we received. Then you'll have the opportunity to discuss, call for any more testimony, and then decide on this issue. For your consideration are several proposed changes to the grant review process and 2 options for structuring the review. Both of these options include changes that were raised and recommendations made by the 2014 reviewers, PCL staff, and PSU. These changes include conducting extensive outreach to recruit reviewers, implementing a reviewer application and screening process, providing more training for reviewers, allowing more time for reviewers to read and score applications, discontinuing the review panel meetings where the reviewers discussed applications and had the option to change scores, offering stipends to volunteer reviewers, and sending score forms to all applicants. And I just want to reiterate that both of these options that I'm going to present next will include all of those things that I just mentioned and will likely result in increase in overall quality of the review process as compared to 2014. And just to let you know, the 2014 process, there weren't big issues with that. In fact, the reviewer evaluations that we got back when we specifically asked for what could be improved, a majority of the people responded, everything was great. This was a really good process. So I don't want you to think that it was a bad process last time. With option 1, each set of reviewers scores the full application. The advantage to option 1, advantages are it's simpler to explain and implement, and the reviewers would score everything that they are reading and reviewing. The disadvantages to this approach are that staff would need to do their best to balance the knowledge and experience of the reviewers for each of the groups of reviewers, and all reviewers would have to score on topics where they may have less knowledge or experience. Option 2 splits the review of each application between 2 sets of reviewers. One set would review and score the organizational capacity and racial equity, diversity, and inclusion section, and the other set of reviewers scores the program and budget sections. The advantage of this approach is that it creates the opportunity to really match the reviewer experience and knowledge with the relevant application sections. So the reviewers with strong experience and knowledge of organizational management and EDI, they would review that section of the application, and those who have the content area and program service delivery experience and knowledge would be reviewing the program and budget sections. The disadvantage of this approach include greater complexity to explain and implement. Total hours of reviewer time are estimated to be more for this option compared to option 1, and there's a heavier administrative burden for PCL staff to coordinate the various elements of the review process with 10 reviewers per application versus 5. So that's an overview. And then at the June 3rd meeting, the committee raised 3 concerns with the review process proposal. First, there was a concern raised that it would be unfair to applicants for reviewers to only see part of an application. And staff just wants to clarify that with both the options, the reviewers would receive the whole application. The difference would be that for option 1, reviewers would read and score the whole application. Option 2, reviewers would read but only score parts of the application. So whichever the option the committee chooses, we'll be sure to clearly explain to applicants what process is being used, and we will explain this through the bidders conferences, in the RFI materials, and also on the FAQs that will be posted on the PCL website. The second concern raised was related to option number 2, The committee expressed concern that splitting the review created greater redundancies because reviewers need and want to read the full application, but only score a portion of that. Staff acknowledges this approach does create redundancy, which is estimated to result in more time, total time for reviewers as compared to option one. This does, as a reminder, splitting the review eliminates the need for staff to average scores in the cases where multiple sets of reviewers are reviewing applications from organizations that submit multiple applications. And then the third concern that was brought up had to do with the timing of the score sheet distribution, and this would be would pertain to either option that's chosen. So one committee member advocated for sending the score sheets to applicants before the end of the funding process to increase transparency. And in a response, staff has built into the proposed timeline, which I'll cover next, time to assemble and send score sheets to the applicants before they provide their written and video testimony to the committee. Staff does have some concern that providing the score sheets to applicants before the committee makes funding decisions will require members to review individual score sheets as well, especially if applicants raise issues related to their scores or comments that the reviewers might have made on the score sheets. So for those of you who have made funding decisions in the past for the levy, I think you'll recall the volume of the applications that you received and the materials to review. So just would ask that you please consider whether or not it's manageable to add the review of individual score sheets to your workload as well. With public comment, we received two pieces of public comment regarding the review process. The first person was seeking clarification regarding the information that reviewers use to score the applications. And just as clarification, staff instruct the reviewers only to score based on the information that is presented in their applications and not use any outside information about the programs or organizations in their scoring. They're just to use the score sheets and the information that was presented. And the other person weighed in on their choice for option one or option two, and they chose option one, stating that it will provide the best outcome. Since there are advantages and disadvantages to each of the options, staff defers to your preference. So time for discussion and
I just have a
testimony.
question. So,
Or questions.
the information is non-committal, which puts us in a precarious place. And given the strong case for a new process, it would be my inclination to stick with what works. That being said, I don't see any reason why we couldn't do a pilot on a smaller basis, have some of the applications maybe in one area, one program area, or maybe you're laughing. Right? You thought about it.
Well,
makes it more
only
complicated,
because then
I
we have
think.
to communicate to that one program area, well, we're going to handle your applications differently than this other program area, and you as an organization.
Paradigm shifts are never easy.
Might be subject to
So
both.
that's the question before us.
I would speak in favor of having two reviewers have it split. And the reason for that is I had an opportunity a number of years ago to sit on an organization that was making much smaller grants than this, and it was in one area, not across areas. But I was a grant reviewer, and it was very interesting that I felt very comfortable in certain areas being able to score and understand and believe that I knew what was happening. When it came to all of the budget areas, I was glad that I didn't have to work on that area because that wasn't something that where I felt adequately trained to really understand how organizations manage their operating budgets and so on. But I think being able to just focus on on the program area itself really allowed me to go deeper into that and really consider what I was doing. So I think for our reviewers to have an opportunity to really use their area of expertise I think is valuable for them. I think it's more fair for the organizations that that the grants are being reviewed by people who have those different areas of expertise. Certainly, there are people in the community who could probably do both very adequately. But I think this has great potential, especially because we are so focused after the feedback that we got from PSU and from Empress Rules and from the community of really wanting us to pay attention to the DEI work. I think that this is another way to say, yes, we are, and we are scoring it separately. So that's my vote.
Go ahead.
It seems like I've been talking too much, so why don't you go next?
So, I mean, this is a tricky one because it is talking about a change, and you never know if it's going to be a good change or a bad change. So sometimes you just have to do it. But I actually appreciate, Julie, your words very much because I feel like that they reflected a lot of what I was thinking. Is if we know that we're going to have experts in DEI or in programs or whatever looking at it, it seems like that's a strength that we're adding to the process. I appreciate Felicia's comments last week, though, when she was talking about, this might be a harder process for the reviewers. I agree. I mean, I think if it was my job, I would just read the whole application, and I think it's almost mandatory, even if you're only scoring one part, because I would imagine that an applicant would want to continue the story that they're telling about how they are going to be, doing the work that they're doing, especially around DEI, both in that one section, but also in the other section. So you would have to, even if you're not, grading it, you want to get the full story that they're presenting to you. So that would be, and so I appreciate that that's part of the requirement is that they would be looking at the full application. So I think that was my big concern. I had a question about the score sheet distribution. Is that, from the perspective of what position does that put reviewers in? If somebody's getting their score sheets back, is it going to be like anonymous or is that going to, okay.
It's anonymous.
Okay.
They would just get the scores, and the reviewers are asked to also provide any constructive comments back to the applicants that will help them understand the score that was awarded.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the information they'll get, but there aren't any names attached to the score sheets.
Okay, all right. I know that's a new thing, and I also think I'm concerned about the impact on the process if they're getting some feedback back before the entire process has gone through, where there has been the chance for the reviewers to be sent to staff. The staff hasn't had a chance to make their recommendation yet, and that we haven't had our chance yet. So I'm a little concerned about what that would do to the system, but. Okay, those are my comments. I didn't really come to any decision on those comments. I was just thinking out loud a little bit.
Well, I guess I worry that this is a solution in search of a problem. And since we haven't had any feedback that we've had reviewers that have done poor jobs on areas that they weren't experienced in, and on the other side of the ledger is Julie's really well-taken point of it's a demonstration to the community that we're doing something. I would be inclined to support the mayor's idea of a pilot project. We don't need to change any scoring, because what I would propose is we simply do it for our own information. So we'll have experts grade a few, split it up, and have them grade a couple and see if there's any difference between what we're getting from two people reviewing one application versus one person reviewing one application. It doesn't have to be every application. We can just take a couple, and they can report to us. It doesn't influence who gets what, because everybody is under the same program. And then if it comes back and it says, geez, our two expert reviewers and our one expert reviewer basically came within statistical similarities of each other, that would be informative. It turns out that we have very different answers when we have two people reviewing it than one. I think that would be good to know, and probably lead us in a different direction. But I just think of the staff time and the recruitment, increase in recruitment. It's not a small undertaking to double the number of reviewers. So I guess I'm looking for a toe in the water step before we jump all the way in.
Can I just make one clarification? So it's not doubling the number of reviewers. There would be 5 additional reviewers. What it doubles is the number of reviewers per application. Just a clarification.
precise there,
Yeah,
but-
no, just for the clarification.
I want to clarify, Mitch, that I think that I understand what you're saying. You're saying internally to look at the information and the data and the scores, not based on the idea of separate processes, not actually do a separate one. All reviewers.
I was just thinking out loud, but if we just proceeded with option 1,
Okay, this is.
but at the same time, we pull out some number of proposals, and we have them graded by 2 people, and those 2 scores are not factored in awards or any report to us until after we've done the full grading and made our decisions, and then we go back and look at it and see if it's something that we want to change going forward. I don't know, Mr. Mayor, if your pilot project looked something different than that, but it seems like it would be pretty low impact on staff to do it that way.
I'm going to think out loud here too, and it may not make any sense. But I'm wondering if instead of having people actually separately review it, but if we went with option 1 and then reviewed scores where we'll know which reviewers had more experience and knowledge in EDI, for example, and pull out those scores and see how they differ from folks who had more experience with program area and content, and see if there was difference in how if we were to have grouped them differently, if there would have been difference in score. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
mean,
anything
does
like
that-
that.
okay.
I mean, anything to where we're, as I said, putting our toe in the water before we commit to a
Full.
a
full-
functioning, well-received process that we have now.
Yeah.
We'll have that information. We're planning on doing recruitment of reviewers in ways that allow us to track information on how they identify what their experience and knowledge is that they're bringing to the process. So we would have a way to look at, these 10 reviewers said they had this experience and knowledge, their average scores here were this.
I guess my question to that is, but what if we do notice a difference?
Then that would inform the next
Process.
time that we do
Yeah,
funding.
Yeah. It would just push that to the next round then. Okay.
Mitch, I'll entertain a motion. Wait, we need public testimony.
Yes.
I haven't
Yes,
asked
please,
for,
thank
I
you.
apologize.
Oh, yeah, somebody might come and answer all our
And
questions.
save
with some
us, save
insightful-
us. Who would like to provide public testimony on this issue?
I don't. No one's gonna say.
I feel like we have to offer free beers or discounts or something.
On your own.
Very good. I'll entertain a motion. Or not.
Well, I guess I'd move for option 1 with the proviso that staff would devise a mechanism that would allow us to evaluate whether or not we could get higher quality reviews done by choosing option B, so that the next time we have a funding round, we'll be able to base a decision on that information.
Before we go further on this, before we have a second, I guess we're supposed to take a second first before I can say something else. So I'll second Mitch's motion. But was there anything specific from either Empress Rules or PSU regarding this part of this, about the scoring?
Great
in this issue?
question. Not from Empress Rules,
Okay.
and PSU's input on review was more about, you all did a pretty good job last time. You weren't very transparent about what you did, so people didn't really know. So do that better and be more intentional in your outreach and recruitment and training of reviewers. So here we are being as
Here we
transparent.
are, being intentional.
Yeah, and option 2 really came out of the comments that you made, Julie, here today, reflect kind of the thinking that went behind option 2.
So I feel like I'm steering in the dark here, and I'm going to support the motion that's currently on the table, but I think it does raise some really interesting and provocative questions. I think Julie's question around budgets is one excellent example. DEI issue is another interesting example. Was anybody else surprised how little testimony and feedback we got on this? Because I was.
I'm surprised.
It struck me as a fairly major change in the way we do things, and I think people are equally grasping at straws here. So it would be helpful to have, I do support the idea of a pilot. I agree it's more work, and we'll have to work with you and find a way that makes that work for you. I'm not trying to pile extra work on your already, at this point, overburdened shoulders, because you do a lot of work for us, and we appreciate it. But I think if we had some sort of an analysis or a pilot project or something, then we'd have more of a robust conversation and people would have more to comment on. I think it's just very, very hard for people to comment on something when we really don't understand the full dynamics of what it is that's being proposed, or as Mitch said, what the problem is we're trying to solve. I don't feel like I have that confidence, so I'm prepared to stick with what ain't broke.
That's reasonable.
Any further discussion?
I would just say that, I mean, this is a tough one. I'm going to support the motion mostly because I really do take to heart what Felicia had said last week, and she seems like she has had the most experience actually being the reviewer, and so I take that, since I haven't had that much experience, to heart. But I do want us to go forward with a pilot of some type, and I think we'll figure out what that looks like in terms of trying to see how we could get at what option 2 is trying to get at in the easiest way to administrate possible, but that's kind of what's tipping the scales for me.
Great.
That's a good point. All right. All in favor, vote aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion
No.
carries. Oh, we have, motion carries 3-1.
And can I ask for a clarification regarding the timing of the distribution of the score sheets to applicants, either before the process ends or at the conclusion?
So to me, that's tied with, we have built in, as I read this, 2 opportunities for comment. One is video and one is written, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Correct.
So did we decide last time that we were going to do both? Because it seems to me like we ought to offer one or the other, but to get a video presentation and then get the same written presentation seems redundant and wasteful of their time and our time.
I don't know that the information in the written I wouldn't assume that applicants would provide the same information in the written versus the video. I would think the video would, well, I don't know, but
You did vote last time to take them both.
take them both.
Well, then, and then I continue to be in favor of the transparency of delivering the actual score sheets anonymously, of course, to the applicants.
Can I ask a clarifying question? In the past, have they received their score sheets at all?
When they
At
were
the end?
when they requested them after the conclusion of the funding process.
Yeah.
So not in advance of funding decisions.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So my understanding on this then is that if applicants receive those scores before we've made our decision, I may receive written information from them explaining something and saying that this was not, that score was given, but this was inaccurate or blah, blah, blah. And I haven't even seen the score either. So the committee also needs to see those score sheets.
Exactly. That would be
Earlier
the-
than we have in the past.
Right.
Yes.
Is that
You
true? Is that
received
what-
the average score, the average total
Yeah.
score, but you did not receive each individual score sheet. So this would mean that you would get
Right.
those score sheets to
We
look
got
at
the
as
score
well.
sheets.
Right. And so then, an applicant could say, I was, one reviewer scored me 15 on this section and another scored me 47. And when I look at the scoring criteria, I think I should have got a 48. And so then you would need to look at all those individual scores and then figure out what you do with that information and how it influences your decision.
Right, so that's the extra part that we receive. All
And
right.
it's not just an aggregate score. We're talking about every single score. from
Every single score
reviewer?
sheet, right.
Okay.
It used to be, I mean, typically we have provided the aggregate score because you haven't typically received the score sheets from per each application. But this time you'd have to get both.
Okay.
So you get 5 score sheets per application going with option 1.
Great.
So yes to that. You want them sent at the time that we send the staff recommendations.
So is this a decision we're making, or is this a given?
This needs to
Well,
be,
it needs to be decided so that we know when to send
Right, so we do have.
when to send them. And when, we need to put it in the, it'll need to go in the RFI so that folks know when they'll be receiving the score sheets.
Well, I certainly agree that it's important for the applicants to have that information before they do their, if they choose to do video testimonies. So I would say that we would need the information that they're receiving also.
is that a motion, Julie? Probably needs to be a motion and decided since this is a point of
Let
clarification.
me ask this before there's a motion. Does anybody here have strong feelings about this? Does anybody have a thought on this? Come on up. I want to hear what you have to say. Come on up. You gave good testimony before. Let's hear it. Since we're going to take a vote, let's hear if anybody has thoughts
I
on
would just
it.
say, if you're going to give the point system.
Yeah, please
you're
have
gonna-
a seat. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You're going to get advocacy. So if I score at 42, when I should have thought at 48, all of you are going to get a contact or some information, so just be prepared for that. I like the idea of transparency and being able to see how you're evaluated. I think it's helpful for me as an executive director because I learn how we present ourselves, and it's always a good opportunity. In this situation, I've never had that opportunity from a Meyer Memorial Trust to get the points before they make their decision, and then they give you something, or, a lot of other places don't do this. So it's an interesting idea. I see value in it, but I think if I were sitting on your side of the dais, I'd be like, that's a lot of paperwork you're going to have to look at, because a lot of people will refute their scores if they feel like they're underscored.
I see a lot of head shaking going on behind you there.
Which is giving us agency as recipients of those funds, which is I appreciate, but I don't know.
Could I ask you a question on this? And thank you. I always appreciate your public testimony, and it's helpful, and it's completely relevant being a provider. Does it steer your narrative at all? I mean, if you get that information, is that going to steer the discussion in terms of what you focus on versus maybe how you'd ordinarily present your organization?
Yes. I mean, I used to be a program officer for an international development organization. And so in that context, we would coach the people who were applying for funding. And if you get feedback from a funder that's saying, I don't understand this, or you're seeing rated, you're obviously being cued that the way that you're communicating it isn't clear or doesn't meet the criteria. Sometimes it just doesn't meet the criteria. And, I would hope that most people would then understand, I don't service this population, or I didn't meet this criteria. But generally speaking, it gives that person, it will steer my narrative in the sense of I would reword it to use different words or address some of the feedback that I might receive from the scorers. Now, I don't remember, because I haven't been in the job long enough to know or if we requested is it just points or are there comments?
It's the whole reviewer score sheet. So they're usually about 5 pages per reviewer, and it's, whether you got 3 out of the 5 points that were available. And sometimes people will write a comment and sometimes they won't. So it would be a PDF copy of every point by point that was on the application, as well as any comments that were written.
But without the reviewers
With-
identifying.
yeah,
Yes, obviously.
the
No
reviewers' names are never
identifying
on them.
features.
Yeah.
I don't know how helpful that would be, to be honest, if it's just points.
Would it help from an organizational learning perspective for future applications? Would that be a value or no?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
But I don't know if the timing of it makes sense.
all right.
And I hate to believe I'm saying that, but
Thanks a lot, appreciate it.
I don't know.
That stir anybody's creative juices.
I think to your point, Mayor, if I understood your question, was sort of, how an applicant presents their advocacy shift if they have their scores and the reviewer score comments before them, as opposed to if they didn't have that information and had to build their case to you all a different way. And yes, I think that you will hear from people about how the process of the review may have been flawed, as opposed to other parts of how they might have constructed that argument, and/or both. But
I'll make a motion that we send those score sheets to the applicants earlier in the process.
Second.
We have a motion, we have a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, vote aye.
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 Aye, opposed? All right, we're going to try it. We'll see how it goes. So thank you to our team. Appreciate that very much. And our last item, and thank you, we've caught up, and I appreciate
it's
is
gonna
to
be
take
quick.
a look at the tentative timeline and some of the steps between now and next April.
Okay, this will be very quick. In your packet, and also as a handout for the audience, is a tentative funding process timeline. So you notice the first thing on the timeline is the next allocation committee meeting, which will be held sometime between September 9th and the 23rd, where you'll meet to make final decisions necessary to begin the funding process and publish the RFIs. So at this meeting,
There's an end in sight.
pardon, what?
There's an end in sight.
Oh, there is. Not yet. We still need to keep going here, but yeah, there is. So at least to this first step, thank you for your patience in all of this. So at the September meeting, you'll be approving requests for investments for each of the program areas, as mentioned by Meg earlier, allocating the available funds by program area, setting minimum and maximum grant amounts, and addressing any other funding requirements for applicants, as well as approving the criteria that staff will use in making their funding recommendations. Staff is proposing one committee meeting to consider these decisions, and in advance of the meeting, staff will provide the recommendations and rationale to the public via the email distribution list, social media, and website posts, so that, and we'll also invite written feedback and invite people to come and testify before you all make decisions in September. So I'm not going to walk you through the whole timeline, but just as a general summary, in the fall, we'd publish the RFI, followed by the bidders conference, and with applications due just before Thanksgiving. The winter, the reviewers will be reviewing and scoring the application, and staff will be preparing all the materials for the allocation committee for your review and your decision-making. And then in the spring, you'll receive those materials and hopefully make funding decisions in May. And just want to reiterate that this is a tentative timeline. Things may come up that call for adjustments, but this is our best estimate at this point. You don't need to vote on this item if you have questions or want to discuss the timeline.
Looks like we're good.
Okay. And we did it before 4 o'clock.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to the incredible PCL staff. Thanks to all of my colleagues here. Thanks to everybody who provided feedback, input, and testimony. Have a great summer. We stand adjourned until September.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your patience in all this.